The demolition crew was already setting up when Margaret Sterling realized the truth. The pool she'd fought so hard to destroy wasn't just her neighbor's backyard addition. It was the key to everything she was about to lose. As the wrecking ball swung toward what she thought was victory, the property deed in David Chen's hand told a different story entirely. Some battles aren't won by those who throw the first punch, but by those who know exactly when to reveal their final card. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove's pristine lawns as Margaret Sterling adjusted her pearls and smoothed her navy blazer. At 62, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of getting her way. Her Tudor-style mansion loomed behind her like a fortress, its perfectly manicured hedges standing at attention like soldiers awaiting orders. She paused at her front gate, her steel-grey eyes fixed on the construction across the street. The sound of concrete mixers and power tools had been her unwelcome alarm clock for 3 weeks now, and today would be the day it stopped. Absolutely barbaric, she muttered, pulling out her phone to document what she considered an assault on civilization itself. David Chen wiped sweat from his forehead as he guided the excavator operator toward the deep end of what would soon be his family's swimming pool. At 38, he had the lean build of someone who still believed in getting his hands dirty, even though his architectural firm could have afforded to hire every aspect of the construction. This pool was personal, a promise to his 8-year-old daughter Emma, who had been asking for swimming lessons since they'd moved to Maple Grove 6 months ago. "Dad, is it going to be ready for my birthday party?" Emma called from the back porch, her dark pigtails bouncing as she hopped from foot to foot. 2 more weeks, sweetheart, David called back, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone juggling. A major project with single parenthood. Just like I promised. His wife Lisa had died in a car accident 18 months ago, and this pool represented more than recreation. It was his attempt to give Emma something joyful to focus on, something that would make their new home feel less like an escape from painful memories and more like a fresh start. Margaret's heels clicked against the asphalt as she marched across the street, her phone already dialing the city's code enforcement office. She'd researched the regulations thoroughly, cross-referencing property setbacks, drainage requirements, and noise ordinances with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case. "Yes, I'd like to report a violation at 847 Maple Grove Drive," she said into the phone, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "The homeowner is installing what appears to be an oversized swimming pool without proper permits, and the construction is not only a noise nuisance but likely to cause drainage issues that will damage neighboring properties." David noticed her approach and felt his stomach tighten. He tried to introduce himself when they'd first moved in, bringing over a bottle of wine and Emma's homemade cookies. Margaret had accepted the gifts with polite coldness, making it clear that pleasantries didn't constitute neighborly approval. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, walking toward the property line with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I know the construction has been disruptive. We are actually ahead of schedule, should be done by next Friday." Margaret ended her call and fixed him with a look that could have frozen the concrete mixer. "Mr. Chen, I'm afraid it's going to be done much sooner than that." "I'm sorry. I've just filed a complaint with the city. Your pool is in violation of several codes, not least of which is the impact it's having on property values. Do you have any idea what a project like this does to the neighborhood?" David felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level for Emma's sake. "All of my permits are in order, Mrs. Sterling. I can show you the documentation if you'd like." "Permits can be issued in error," Margaret replied, adjusting her purse strap with the precision of someone loading ammunition. "And they can certainly be revoked when neighbors raise legitimate concerns about safety and property damage." "Property damage?" David's voice cracked slightly. "Mrs. Sterling, I've been careful to ensure the excavation doesn't affect drainage patterns. I'm an architect. I understand how these systems work." Margaret's smile was thin and sharp. "Are you a hydrologist, Mr. Chen? Because I've had one examine the proposed pool location and has identified several potential issues with groundwater flow that could affect my foundation." David stared at her, realizing with growing dread that this wasn't a neighborly concern. It was a calculated attack. "You hired a hydrologist." "I hire whatever experts are necessary to protect my investment," Margaret said. "This house has been in my family for 37 years. I won't have its value diminished by someone who thinks suburban living means they can do whatever they please." Emma appeared at David's side, having crept closer to hear the conversation. Her small hand slipped into his, and he could feel her trembling slightly. "Is the mean lady going to make us move again?" Emma whispered. Margaret's expression softened for just a moment as she looked at the little girl, but it hardened again. When she met David's eyes, "I'm simply ensuring that this neighborhood maintains the standards that make it desirable, young lady. Sometimes that means adults have to make difficult decisions." "Emma, go inside and work on your homework," David said gently. "I'll be in soon." As his daughter reluctantly walked away, David turned back to Margaret with renewed intensity. "Mrs. Sterling, I understand you have concerns, but threatening to shut down a legitimate construction project because you don't like the noise is threatening." Margaret's voice rose an octave. "Mr. Chen, I am exercising my rights as a property owner and a citizen. If you had bothered to consult with your neighbors before beginning this project, we might have found a solution that worked for everyone. I followed every required procedure for permits and notifications, the bare minimum legal requirements," Margaret interrupted. "But what about courtesy? What about community standards? What about the fact that your pool will overlook my garden, destroying the privacy I've cultivated for decades?" David looked toward her property, noting the 8-foot privacy fence that already blocked any view between their yards. "Mrs. Sterling, you can't even see our backyard from your house." "That's not the point." Margaret's composure cracked slightly, revealing the fury beneath her polished exterior. "The point is that you moved into an established neighborhood and immediately began making changes that affect everyone around you. You didn't consider the impact on traffic during construction, the noise disruption, or the precedent you're setting for other homeowners who might think they can install whatever recreational facilities they please. It's a swimming pool, not an amusement park," David said, his patience finally fraying. "Families have pools in residential neighborhoods all across America." "Not in my neighborhood," Margaret replied with finality. "Not if I have anything to say about it." A pickup truck pulled up to the curb, and a man in a city inspector's uniform climbed out, carrying a clipboard and camera. Margaret's smile returned, victorious and cold. "That was fast," David muttered. "I have the inspector's direct number," Margaret said. "Bill Morrison and I have worked together on several neighborhood preservation issues over the years." Inspector Morrison approached with the weary expression of someone who had mediated too many neighbor disputes. He was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and the careful demeanor of a public servant who had learned to avoid taking sides. "Morning, Mrs. Sterling," he said with professional courtesy. "Got your call about a potential code violation." "Thank you for coming so quickly, Bill," Margaret replied, her voice warm with false friendliness. "I'm concerned about several aspects of this construction project." Morrison turned to David with an apologetic nod. "You must be the homeowner. Mind if I take a look at what you've got going on here?" "Of course," David said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I have all the permit documentation right here, plus the architectural plans and engineering reports." As Morrison examined the paperwork, Margaret began pointing out various aspects of the construction she found objectionable. "The excavation is deeper than what's typical for residential pools, which suggests they're not following standard guidelines. The concrete trucks have been damaging the street surface. You can see the tire marks, and the noise level exceeds city ordinances for residential areas." "Mrs. Sterling," Morrison said patiently, "construction noise is permitted between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, and I don't see anything in these permits that's obviously problematic." Margaret's jaw tightened. "What about the drainage impact? I have documentation from a hydrologist showing that this pool could cause water to accumulate against neighboring foundations." Morrison looked at the drainage plans David had submitted, then walked around the excavation site, taking measurements and photos. "The engineering report addresses drainage pretty comprehensively," he said finally. "Shows proper grading and runoff management." "But surely you need to verify that the actual construction matches the plans," Margaret pressed. "And what about the setback requirements? I believe the pool is too close to the property." Margaret Sterling's home office was a shrine to control and precision. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases lined the walls, filled with legal texts, property law references, and 3 decades of neighborhood association meeting minutes organized by date and topic. Her mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a single manila folder labeled 847 Maple Grove Drive in her precise handwriting. She sat in her leather chair, reading glasses perched on her nose, as she scrolled through David Chen's business records on her computer. What had started as simple background research was revealing information that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. Chen and Associates Architecture, she murmured, clicking through the firm's website. Specializing in sustainable residential design. The company appeared successful enough. Several award-winning projects, testimonials from satisfied clients, and a staff of 6 employees. But Margaret's years of real estate investment had taught her to look deeper than surface presentations. She pulled up the county business records, cross-referencing them with property tax filings and construction permits across the city. The pattern that emerged made her smile with predatory satisfaction. David's firm had taken on several high-end residential projects over the past 2 years, but the completion dates told a story of delays and complications. 3 projects had run significantly over budget, resulting in client disputes that had been settled out of court. 1 luxury home renovation had been abandoned mid-construction when the clients fired the firm and hired a replacement contractor. Financial stress, Margaret said aloud, making notes in her leather-bound journal. Overextended and underperforming. She cross-referenced the information with David's personal property records and discovered that he'd purchased the Maple Grove house with a significant mortgage, putting down barely 20%. For someone in his income bracket, it suggested he was leveraging heavily to maintain his lifestyle after what appeared to be business difficulties. The doorbell interrupted her research. Margaret glanced at her antique clock, 9:47 p.m. She wasn't expecting visitors, but the timing could only mean one thing. Someone was responding to the calls she'd made earlier that evening. She opened the door to find Janet Holloway, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, holding a steaming coffee cup and wearing the expression of someone who had been summoned for an emergency consultation. "I came as soon as I could," Janet said, stepping into Margaret's foyer. "Your message sounded urgent." Janet was Margaret's closest ally in neighborhood politics, a woman whose passion for property values and community standards had made her the perfect partner in Margaret's previous campaigns against unsightly landscaping, unauthorized business operations, and what they termed architectural inconsistencies. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, leading Janet toward the office. "We have a situation that requires immediate action." She handed Janet the folder she'd compiled on David Chen, watching her friend's expression grow increasingly serious as she reviewed the contents. "My God, Margaret," Janet whispered. "He's essentially bankrupt." "Not quite," Margaret corrected, "but close enough to be dangerous. A man in his financial position will cut corners, ignore regulations, and prioritize speed over quality. That pull represents a desperate attempt to create the appearance of prosperity while his business collapses around him." Janet set down the folder and looked at Margaret with the expression of someone recognizing a masterful strategy. "What do you need from the HOA?" "I need you to call an emergency meeting," Margaret said. "Tonight's inspection showed that his permits are technically valid, but that doesn't mean the project serves the community's best interests. We need to establish new guidelines that prevent this type of construction in the future, and we need to make it clear that homeowners who can't maintain their properties to community standards shouldn't be taking on major construction projects." Janet nodded slowly. "The covenant restrictions give us significant authority over exterior modifications. Even with valid permits, we can impose additional requirements for projects that might impact neighborhood character." "Exactly," Margaret said, feeling the familiar thrill of a plan coming together. "But we need to move quickly. If he completes that pool, it becomes much harder to force changes retroactively." As Janet left to begin making calls to other board members, Margaret returned to her computer and began researching David's personal history. What she found made her pause, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she read about Lisa Chen's death in a car accident 18 months earlier. For a moment, Margaret felt an uncomfortable pang of sympathy. She understood loss. Her husband Harold had died 5 years ago, leaving her to manage their substantial real estate portfolio alone. But sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford when protecting her neighborhood's integrity. She pushed the feeling aside and continued her research, discovering that David had moved to Maple Grove from across town, selling his previous home quickly, and at a loss that suggested desperation rather than choice. The timeline suggested he was running from something: memories, debt, or both. Margaret made additional notes, constructing a profile of a man whose judgment was compromised by grief and financial pressure. Such a person couldn't be trusted to make decisions that affected an entire community. Meanwhile, across the street, David sat at his kitchen table with architectural plans spread before him, double-checking every measurement and specification for the 10th time that day. Emma was asleep upstairs, exhausted from a day of watching the construction progress with the excitement only an 8-year-old could maintain in the face of adult complications. His phone buzzed with a text from his foreman, Carlos. Inspector cleared us to pour concrete tomorrow. Still on schedule for Friday completion. David felt a moment of relief, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. Margaret Sterling's threat had the weight of someone who meant every word, and her confidence suggested she had more weapons in her arsenal than one failed inspection. He pulled out his laptop and began researching Margaret herself, finding an extensive digital footprint of neighborhood activism and property disputes. She had led successful campaigns against a proposed corner market, a home-based business, and a family who had installed what she termed an inappropriately modern fence. In each case, she had used a combination of legal pressure, social influence, and procedural manipulation to get her way. David found meeting minutes from HOA board sessions where Margaret had argued against allowing children's play equipment in front yards, had successfully lobbied for restrictions on holiday decorations, and had pushed through requirements for pre-approval of any exterior paint colors that deviated from an approved palette. "She's not just a neighbor," he muttered. "She's a neighborhood dictator." His research revealed that Margaret owned not just her own house, but 2 rental properties in adjacent neighborhoods, giving her significant influence with local real estate agents and property managers. She sat on the boards of 3 different community organizations and had contributed substantial amounts to city council campaigns over the past decade. David felt a growing sense of unease as he realized he wasn't just fighting one angry neighbor. He was up against someone with institutional power and the connections to use it effectively. His phone rang, and he recognized the number as Carlos, his construction foreman. "David, we might have a problem," Carlos said without preamble. "I just got a call from the concrete supplier. Someone contacted them claiming there were problems with our permits, and they're threatening to cancel tomorrow's delivery." David's blood went cold. What kind of problems? They wouldn't give specifics, just said they received a complaint from a neighborhood resident claiming the project was proceeding without proper authorization. The supplier doesn't want to get involved in a dispute, so they're putting a hold on all deliveries until we can provide additional documentation. "Carlos, I have every single permit and approval we need. The city inspector signed off on everything this afternoon." "I know, boss, but suppliers don't want liability issues. If someone's making noise about illegal construction, they'd rather walk away from the sale than risk getting sued later." David ran his hand through his hair, feeling the walls closing in. How long do we have before the concrete sets up too much to work with? The excavation is ready now, but if we don't pour by Friday, we'll have to regrade everything. That's another week of delays, plus additional costs for site preparation. What about other suppliers? "I can try, but word spreads fast in this business. If one supplier is spooked, others will be too." After hanging up, David stared at the architectural plans spread across his table, seeing not just a swimming pool but his daughter's faith in his ability to keep his promises. His attempt to build something positive after months of grief and struggle, and his family's fresh start being systematically destroyed by one vindictive neighbor. He walked to the window and looked across the street at Margaret's house, where lights blazed in what appeared to be her home office. She was up late, no doubt planning her next move with the methodical precision of someone who had turned destruction into an art form. David pulled out his phone and called his business partner, Jim Morrison, no relation to the city. The Maple Grove Community Center had never hosted a more packed emergency HOA meeting. Margaret Sterling surveyed the crowded room with satisfaction, noting that nearly 40 residents had responded to Janet Holloway's urgent notifications. She had orchestrated this gathering with the precision of a political campaign, ensuring that her core supporters occupied the front rows while potential dissidents were scattered throughout the back. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Janet began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had chaired these meetings for 6 years. "We are here tonight to address a matter of urgent concern regarding construction activities that may impact our community's character and property values." David sat in the back corner with his business partner Jim Morrison, who had arrived an hour earlier with a thick folder of research on Margaret Sterling. The information Jim had uncovered was both illuminating and deeply concerning. "She's not just a neighborhood busybody," Jim had whispered as they entered the meeting. "Margaret Sterling owns 4 properties in this area, including 2 rentals. That generates significant income. She's on the board of directors for 3 real estate investment firms, and she's been quietly buying up properties that come on the market before they're publicly listed." David absorbed this information while watching Margaret command the room like a seasoned politician. She stood near the front, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that projected both authority and respectability, her silver hair styled in a way that suggested she took this meeting as seriously as a corporate board presentation. "As many of you know," Janet continued, "we've had concerns raised about a construction project at 847 Maple Grove Drive that may not align with our community standards." A murmur rippled through the crowd. David recognized several of his neighbors, including the Johnsons from next door, who had brought their teenage son despite the late hour. Mrs. Patterson from across the street sat 3 rows ahead, occasionally glancing back at him with what appeared to be sympathy. Margaret rose from her seat with practiced timing, having clearly coordinated this moment with Janet. "If I may address the board," she said, her voice pitched to carry authority without seeming aggressive. "The floor recognizes Margaret Sterling." Janet replied formally. Margaret turned to face the assembled residents, her expression grave with manufactured concern. "Friends and neighbors, we find ourselves at a crossroads that will define the future character of our community. The construction project in question, a large swimming pool being installed by a relative newcomer to our neighborhood, represents more than just one family's recreational preferences." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "It represents a fundamental question about who we are as a community and what standards we are willing to maintain." David felt his jaw tighten as Margaret began her carefully rehearsed presentation, complete with photographs of the construction site that she'd taken from multiple angles to make the excavation appear more disruptive than it actually was. "The noise levels have exceeded acceptable limits for residential areas," Margaret continued, producing a tablet with what appeared to be decibel readings. "The construction traffic has damaged our street surfaces, and the scale of the excavation raises serious questions about drainage impacts that could affect multiple properties." She gestured toward an easel that Janet uncovered, revealing a poster-sized diagram that purported to show water flow patterns around David's property. The diagram was professionally prepared and looked official, though David immediately recognized several inaccuracies in the topographical representations. "But beyond the immediate construction impacts," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly for emphasis, "we must consider the precedent this sets. If we allow one homeowner to install recreational facilities without proper community input, where does it end? Swimming pools today, tennis courts tomorrow, and eventually the quiet residential character that drew us all to Maple Grove will be destroyed." Several residents nodded, and David heard murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Margaret had skillfully framed the issue not as one neighbor's vindictive complaint, but as a community-wide concern about protecting shared values. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I've discovered troubling information about the financial stability of the contractor responsible for this project." David's blood went cold. She was going to attack him personally, in front of his neighbors, using information she had no right to possess. Public records show that Chen and Associates Architecture has been involved in multiple construction disputes over the past 2 years, with several projects abandoned or completed significantly over budget. Given the scale and complexity of this swimming pool project, I believe we have legitimate concerns about whether it will be completed to professional standards or whether it might be abandoned mid-construction, leaving our neighborhood with an unsightly excavation site. David stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes turning toward him. "May I respond to these accusations?" Janet looked uncomfortable, clearly not having expected David to attend the meeting. "This is a board meeting, Mr. Chen. Residents may address the board during the public comment period." "When is that scheduled?" David asked, his voice carrying across the silent room. "At the end of the meeting," Janet replied. Margaret smiled coldly. "I think we should hear from Mr. Chen now," she said with false magnanimity. "After all, transparency serves everyone's interests." David walked toward the front of the room, acutely aware that he was walking into a carefully prepared ambush. But 18 months of single parenthood had taught him that sometimes the only way out of a difficult situation was straight through it. "Thank you," he said, turning to face the assembled residents. "I want to address Mrs. Sterling's concerns directly, because they deserve direct answers. He pulled out his phone and connected it to the room's projection system, displaying the approved permits and engineering reports that Margaret had dismissed as inadequate. First, regarding permits and approvals, every aspect of this construction has been reviewed and approved by qualified city engineers. The drainage analysis Mrs. Sterling questions was conducted by Patterson Engineering, the same firm that designed the drainage systems for 3 major subdivisions in this city. He clicked to the next screen, showing the construction timeline and budget documentation. Second, regarding my firm's financial stability, it's true that we've had client disputes. What Mrs. Sterling didn't mention is that 2 of those disputes involve clients who tried to make significant changes mid-construction without paying for additional work, and 1 involved a client who filed false insurance claims to avoid paying legitimate construction costs. David could see Margaret's composure flickering as he systematically addressed each of her claims with documented evidence. The project Mrs. Sterling describes as abandoned was actually terminated when we discovered the client was using our construction site to hide assets during a federal fraud investigation. We voluntarily withdrew from that project and cooperated fully with federal investigators. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and David noticed several residents looking at Margaret with new skepticism. Third, regarding community impact, I'm installing a residential swimming pool that meets all code requirements and is smaller than pools in dozens of other neighborhoods throughout this city. The noise Mrs. Sterling complains about is construction equipment operating during permitted hours, and it will end when construction is complete this Friday. He clicked to a final screen showing comparable properties with pools in similar neighborhoods. Finally, regarding precedent, swimming pools are common recreational amenities in residential neighborhoods. They're not the first step toward transforming Maple Grove into a commercial district. They're what families do when they want their children to learn to swim. David paused, looking directly at Margaret. My 8-year-old daughter Emma is counting on having her birthday party at our pool next weekend. This pool represents a promise I made to her after we lost her mother in a car accident 18 months ago. It's not a threat to anyone's property values. It's not a violation of community standards. It's a father trying to give his daughter something to look forward to. The room fell silent. David could see that his personal story had shifted the emotional tenor of the meeting, and several residents were now looking at Margaret with obvious disapproval. But Margaret Sterling hadn't accumulated 30 years of neighborhood political power by folding under pressure. She stood up with renewed determination, her voice taking on the sharp edge of someone whose authority had been challenged. Mr. Chen's personal circumstances are certainly sympathetic, she said, but they don't change the legal and practical concerns his project raises. Emotional appeals don't address drainage problems or construction violations. She turned to face the board members directly. I move that this board invoke Section 4.3 of our community covenants, requiring additional architectural review for any exterior modifications that exceed $25,000 in value or significantly alter the visual character of participating properties. Janet consulted the covenant documents with practiced efficiency. Section 4.3 does give the board authority to require additional review of major exterior. Jim Morrison arrived at David's house at 6 a.m. carrying 2 large coffee cups and a briefcase that looked like it could contain state secrets. As David's business partner and former investigative journalist, Jim had spent the night conducting the kind of deep research that had once earned him a Pulitzer nomination for exposing municipal corruption. You're not going to believe what I found, Jim said, settling into David's kitchen chair and opening his laptop. Margaret Sterling isn't just a neighborhood busybody. She's running a sophisticated real estate operation that would make corporate raiders jealous. David poured himself coffee with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months. The previous night's defeat had crystallized something inside him, a cold determination that felt foreign but surprisingly comfortable. Show me, he said. Jim pulled up a complex spreadsheet showing property transactions over the past decade. In the last 10 years, Margaret has been involved in the purchase or sale of 17 properties in this neighborhood and the 2 adjacent ones. Not as an agent, she's not licensed, but as what she calls a community investment consultant. What does that mean? It means she identifies properties that she considers problematic, families who don't maintain their homes to her standards, people who make modifications she doesn't approve of, anyone who challenges her authority, and then she makes their lives difficult until they decide to sell. Jim clicked to a new screen showing a timeline of harassment campaigns. The Martinez family you heard about last night? After Margaret blocked their deck project, They received 17 code violation notices in 6 months. All technically legitimate, all requiring expensive corrections, all perfectly timed to create maximum financial pressure. David studied the documentation, feeling a growing sense of recognition. She's systematically targeting families. It gets worse, Jim continued. Once these families decide to sell, Margaret's network of real estate contacts ensures the properties are purchased by buyers who meet her approval, usually childless couples or retirees who won't challenge neighborhood politics. She gets a finder's fee for identifying the properties, and her own property values increase as she shapes the neighborhood demographic. Is any of this illegal? Harassment can be, but she's careful to work within legal boundaries. Code violations, HOA covenant enforcement, procedural challenges, it's all technically legitimate. But the pattern is unmistakable. Jim pulled up another document that made David's blood run cold. Here's the really interesting part. 3 of the properties she helped facilitate purchases for. They're now rental properties owned by Sterling Holdings LLC, a company she manages for a group of investors. She's buying the houses herself. Through intermediaries, but yes. She drives out families she doesn't approve of, helps arrange the sales through her real estate network, and then her investment group purchases the properties. It's gentrification with a personal touch. David walked to his window and looked across the street at Margaret's imposing Tudor mansion. How much money are we talking about? Based on the property values and transaction fees, she's probably cleared close to $2 million over the past decade, not counting the rental income from properties she now controls. The magnitude of the operation stunned David. This wasn't neighborhood activism. It was a business model based on systematic intimidation and demographic manipulation. There's more, Jim said quietly. I found records of 3 families who fought back instead of selling. All 3 ended up in legal battles that lasted years and cost them tens of thousands in attorney fees. Margaret has a network of lawyers who specialize in property disputes, and she's not afraid to use them. David turned back to his partner. What happened to those families? 2 of them eventually moved away anyway, financially exhausted from fighting. The 3rd family, the Hendersons, are still here, but they've basically been ostracized from all neighborhood activities. Their kids were excluded from playgroups, they stopped getting invited to block parties, and Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that she feels like a prisoner in her own home. David felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. She's not just protecting her neighborhood. She's systematically destroying families. And she's very good at it, Jim said. Her methods are sophisticated, her documentation is thorough, and she has institutional support from people who either benefit from her activities or are too intimidated to oppose her. David's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, who was staying at her grandmother's house for the week. Is our pool going to be ready for my party, Daddy? The simple question hit him like a physical blow. He had promised Emma that nothing would stop their fresh start, that they would build something beautiful together in their new home. Margaret Sterling was trying to take that away, not because the pool violated any legitimate community interest, but because David represented the kind of family she wanted to eliminate from her carefully curated neighborhood. Jim, I need you to help me understand something, David said. If Margaret has been doing this for years, why hasn't anyone stopped her? Because stopping her requires resources most families don't have, Jim replied. Legal challenges are expensive and time-consuming. Community organizing takes energy that working parents don't have. And Margaret has perfected the art of making resistance look unreasonable. What do you mean? Jim pulled up meeting minutes from previous HOA disputes. Look at how she frames every conflict. She's never the aggressor, she's always the concerned neighbor protecting community standards. Anyone who opposes her gets painted as selfish, unreasonable, or hostile to neighborhood values. She's turned property maintenance into a moral issue and positioned herself as the defender of community virtue. David studied the documents, recognizing the same rhetorical strategies Margaret had used against him the previous night. She's running a propaganda campaign. More than that, Jim said. She's created a system where opposing her requires more social and financial resources than most people have. It's easier to comply with her demands or move away than to fight back. But what if someone had resources she doesn't expect? Jim looked at his partner with growing concern. David, what are you thinking? David walked back to the window, studying Margaret's house with the analytical eye he usually reserved for architectural problems. I'm thinking that Margaret Sterling has built her entire operation on the assumption that her victims will be isolated, intimidated, and financially vulnerable. She picks on families who can't afford extended legal battles and don't have the community connections to organize effective resistance. That's exactly what she does. Then maybe it's time. She encountered someone who doesn't fit her victim profile, David said quietly. Jim closed his laptop and looked at his partner with the expression of someone recognizing a fundamental shift in another person's character. David, what are you planning? I'm planning to give Margaret Sterling exactly what she's been giving other families for the past decade, David replied. Systematic pressure, procedural challenges, and the gradual realization that her way of doing business has consequences. This could get ugly. It's already ugly, David said. Margaret Sterling has been destroying families for profit, while hiding behind community standards and neighborhood concern. She's turned my daughter's birthday present into a weapon to force us out of our home. The only difference is that now she's picked on someone who has the resources to fight back. David's phone rang, and he recognized the number as Carlos, his construction foreman. David, we've got a problem, Carlos said. Someone called the city this morning claiming we violated the construction moratorium. They're threatening to fine us and revoke our permits if we don't immediately restore the site to its original condition. Margaret, David muttered. It gets worse. They're demanding we fill in the excavation by Friday or face daily fines of $500. David felt the familiar surge of protective rage that had become his most reliable emotion since Lisa's death. Carlos, don't do anything yet. I'll call you back within an hour. After hanging up, David turned to Jim with an expression his partner had never seen before, calm, focused, and completely without mercy. Jim, I need you to research every property Margaret owns, every business relationship she has, and every legal filing she's made in the past decade. I want to know about every permit she's pulled, every tax assessment she's challenged, and every code violation notice she's ever received. David, I also need you to find out everything you can about Sterling Holdings LLC. Who are the other investors? Where do they get their financing? What properties do they own? And how did they acquire them? Jim stared at his partner, recognizing that the grieving widower who had been trying to build a simple swimming pool was gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. What are you going to do with this information? David smiled for the first time in weeks, a cold, calculating expression that would have made Margaret Sterling very nervous if she had seen it. I'm going to teach Margaret Sterling that some neighbors fight back, he said. And I'm going to make sure she understands that when you threaten a single father's promises to his daughter, you better be prepared for the consequences. David walked to his home office and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to sketch what Lou. Margaret Sterling was enjoying her morning coffee when the first violation notice arrived. She opened the official city envelope with casual confidence, expecting another routine matter that her network of contacts could easily resolve. Instead, she found herself staring at a comprehensive code enforcement citation that made her hands tremble. An authorized business operation in residential zone, she read aloud, her voice catching slightly. Multiple commercial vehicles regularly accessing property for business purposes not consistent with residential zoning regulations. The citation was accompanied by photographs of her home office, taken from a public vantage point that clearly showed the steady stream of real estate agents, contractors, and property investors who visited her house for what the city now classified as commercial meetings. Margaret's phone rang before she could fully process the implications. Mrs. Sterling? This is Janet Holloway. I just received the strangest call from the city planning department. They're saying someone filed a complaint about your home office violating residential zoning laws. Margaret felt her carefully constructed world beginning to shift. That's ridiculous. I conduct occasional meetings in my home, just like thousands of other residents. The complaint apparently includes documentation of regular business activities, commercial vehicle traffic, and what they're calling systematic real estate operations inconsistent with residential use, Janet said, her voice carrying the strain of someone realizing she might be associated with something problematic. As Margaret hung up, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find a young man in a suit holding a clipboard and wearing an expression of professional courtesy. Mrs. Sterling? I'm Tom Bradley from the City Tax Assessment Office. We need to discuss some discrepancies in your property tax filings. What kind of discrepancies? Well, you've been claiming residential exemptions on properties that appear to be operated as commercial enterprises. We also have questions about rental income that may not have been properly reported for tax purposes. Margaret's mind raced as she invited the assessor inside, trying to understand how her carefully managed business operations had suddenly become visible to city authorities. She had spent years developing relationships with the right people, making contributions to the right campaigns, and maintaining the facade of community activism that protected her more profitable activities. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," she said, leading Bradley toward her office. "I hope so," Bradley replied, pulling out a thick folder. "But we've received detailed documentation suggesting systematic property speculation, unreported rental income, and possible tax fraud. We are going to need to examine your records." As Bradley began his inspection, Margaret's phone rang again. This time it was Harold Wesselman, her longtime ally on the HOA board. "Margaret, we need to talk. I just got served with a subpoena requesting all HOA records related to property violations and covenant enforcement over the past 10 years. "A subpoena? From whom?" "Some law firm I've never heard of. They're asking for meeting minutes, correspondence, enforcement actions, everything. And Margaret, they specifically mentioned your involvement in targeting certain homeowners." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Someone was conducting a systematic investigation of her activities, using the same methodical approach she had perfected against her own victims. Across the street, David Chen sat in his home office reviewing the morning's progress with grim satisfaction. The army of lawyers, investigators, and municipal contacts that Jim Morrison had assembled was executing their strategy with military precision. "The tax assessment should keep her busy for weeks," Jim said, checking items off a detailed timeline. "Even if she's been completely legitimate, which I doubt, she'll need to hire accountants and tax attorneys to respond to the audit." "What? About the zoning violation?" "That's the beautiful part," Jim replied. "Everything we documented is technically accurate. She has been running a commercial operation out of her home. The city just never bothered to investigate because she's been careful to maintain the right relationships." David looked at the comprehensive dossier they had compiled on Margaret's activities. 3 weeks of intensive investigation had revealed a web of questionable practices, unreported income, and potential legal violations that would require months to fully unravel. "The HOA subpoena will be the most damaging," Jim continued. "Once we get those records into legal discovery, we can document the pattern of targeted harassment and possibly file civil rights violations." "How long before she realizes this is coordinated?" "She probably already knows," Jim said. "But the beauty of fighting institutional corruption is that once you start pulling threads, the whole fabric begins to unravel. Every agency that investigates her will find legitimate problems that require legitimate responses." David's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Grandma says someone is asking about our house at her work. Is everything okay?" The message reminded David of the personal stakes behind his systematic campaign. This wasn't just about defeating Margaret Sterling. It was about protecting his daughter from a woman who would destroy their family to maintain her control over the neighborhood. "Jim, what's the status on the property research?" "That's where things get really interesting," Jim said, pulling up a new set of documents. "Sterling Holdings LLC has been claiming property tax exemptions based on owner occupancy for properties that are clearly rental investments. We are talking about potential tax fraud in the tens of thousands of dollars. And the rental properties themselves. 2 of them have code violations that have been ignored for years, violations that would normally result in substantial fines. Margaret's been using her city contacts to get special treatment for her investment properties while demanding strict enforcement against families she wants to drive out." David felt the familiar surge of cold anger. She's been above the law while using that same law as a weapon against other people. "Exactly. But now that we've made her activities visible to the right agencies, she'll have to follow the same rules as everyone else." The doorbell interrupted their planning session. David opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had warned him about Margaret's pattern of harassment. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said nervously. "But I wanted to give you this." She handed him a manila envelope filled with documents, copies of letters, meeting minutes, and correspondence spanning several years. I've been keeping records of Margaret's activities, Mrs. Patterson explained. I never knew what to do with them, but after what happened at the board meeting, I thought you might find them useful. David opened the envelope and felt his pulse quicken. The documents detailed Margaret's systematic campaign against the Martinez family, including private correspondence where she explicitly discussed strategies for encouraging their relocation and coordinated efforts to make their lives difficult. Mrs. Patterson, this is evidence of intentional harassment. I know, she said quietly. I should have spoken up years ago, but I was afraid she'd target me next. Margaret Sterling has made this neighborhood a place where people are afraid to oppose her. Not anymore, David said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. She's about to learn what it feels like to be on the receiving end of systematic pressure. After Mrs. Patterson left, David called his attorney, not the general practice lawyer who had handled his wife's estate, but the aggressive civil rights specialist that Jim had recommended. Sarah, it's David Chen. I'm ready to file the harassment and civil rights complaints we discussed. Excellent, Sarah Mitchell replied. I've been reviewing the documentation your partner provided. This Sterling woman has created a textbook case of housing discrimination and intentional infliction of emotional distress. What are we looking at in terms of damages? For you personally, we can seek compensation for construction delays, additional costs, and emotional distress. But the bigger opportunity is a class action on behalf of all the families she's targeted over the years. David felt a surge of satisfaction. How many families are we talking about? Based on the pattern Jim documented, potentially 15 to 20 families over the past decade. If we can prove systematic discrimination, and the evidence suggests we are looking at significant damages and possibly criminal referrals. What about stopping her current activities? We'll seek immediate injunctive relief to prevent further harassment, plus restraining orders to keep her from interfering with your construction project. The beauty of fighting bullies through the legal system is that judges don't like people who abuse process to harm their neighbors. That afternoon, David received a call from Carlos with news that made him smile for the first time in weeks. David, the city just called. They're withdrawing the order to fill in the excavation. Apparently, someone higher up reviewed our permits and determined that the work stoppage was improper. What changed? I don't ask questions when good news comes, Carlos replied. But I heard through the grapevine that the building inspector who issued the stop work order is being investigated for selective enforcement. Something about playing favorites with certain residents. David looked across the street at Margaret's house, where he could see her pacing back and forth in her office wind.